Hi, and welcome to another installment of the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. I'm Andrew Forbes, and today I'm happy to be speaking to Luke Epplin, author of Our Team, the epic story of four men in the World Series that changed baseball. Luke's writing has appeared online in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, GQ, Slate, Salon, The Daily Beast, and the Paris Review Daily. Born and raised in rural Illinois, Luke now lives in New York City. Our Team is his first book. The book traces the origins and careers of Larry Doby, Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, all members of the 1948 American League pennant-winning Cleveland Club, and Bill Veeck, the team's flamboyant owner. In the book's introduction, Luke writes, "Their unlikely union would elevate new athletic idols and lead to the reevaluation of old ones, would remake sports as a business and the individual athlete as a brand, and would help puncture long-standing stereotypes that so much of white America harbored toward black ball players." As the backbone of a team that epitomized the post-war American spirit in all its hopes and contradictions, Veeck, Feller, Paige, and Doby would captivate the nation during their thrilling run to the World Series in 1948, all the while shining a light forward for a country on the verge of a civil rights revolution. Luke, first of all, congratulations on the publication of the book, which is really wonderful. It's a great read, and welcome to the book club.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm happy to be here.
So my first question is, why this subject? You were not a Cleveland fan, you've told me. I wonder if you can tell us what brought you to this subject.
Yes, I'm not a Cleveland fan. As you mentioned in your introduction, I grew up in Southern Illinois, small town near St. Louis. I've been a Cardinals fan my entire life. I've been going to Cardinals games since I was a little boy. My only sort of personal connection is that my grandfather, on my father's side, he was hard of hearing, and so he was not drafted in World War II. Instead, he went to St. Louis and worked in airplane factories for the war during that time. And after his shift was over, he would oftentimes hop streetcars to go to Sportsman's Park. He was not there to see the St. Louis Cardinals. He was there to see the St. Louis Browns. There were two major league teams in St. Louis at that time, as I'm sure listeners know, the St. Louis Cardinals, the St. Louis Browns. My grandfather was unusual in that he was a diehard Browns fan. So I grew up knowing the history of the Browns, hearing stories about them from my grandpa. And of course, anybody who knows anything about the Browns knows the last owner of the team was Bill Veeck. And many of the most notorious stunts that he's known for happened during his short tenure on the Browns. So I originally was interested in Veeck and wanted to write a sort of colorful narrative about him. Originally, I thought that was going to be with the Browns. But when I was researching his time on the Indians, that's what really sort of captivated me. And I started noticing these other figures, as you mentioned, Bob Feller, Larry Doby, Satchel Paige, and seeing how these figures were sort of interestingly in tension and complemented each other. And that's where the idea for the book came from.
I'm interested in the writing of the book. This is something of a sort of a writer's craft question, but I wonder about the process of writing it. Your bibliography is massive. It's very extensive, but the prose itself isn't heavy or weighed down by that, which is often a pitfall of so much research. It's a delight to read this book because it so skillfully weaves these men's stories together right up until the culminating feature, the 1948 World Series. So I wonder if this was a difficult book to write, first to research it and then to actually write and assemble, to craft these parts together.
Yeah, I guess it kind of was. I think the most unfortunate thing is that the book takes place in 1946 to 1948. I started to really research it in earnest 3 to 4 years ago. So by the time that I did that, so many of the principal characters in the book, including the four main men, had passed away, which limited, of course, the sort of firsthand stories that I could have gotten. So I did have to rely quite extensively on archives and on the bibliography that you mentioned. I mean, luckily, there's been a lot written about these four individuals. In fact, these individuals themselves wrote a lot about themselves. Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, and Satchel Paige all published more than one autobiography during their lifetime. Larry Doby did not publish an autobiography, but they all have biographies written about them. And there's a lot of archival material that is around about them. So I figured that the way that I framed the story and the way that I wanted to tell it, I wanted to make it as compelling and as sort of entertaining as possible because I just think it's a sort of alternate story of integration than the one that we are normally told, which is, of course, Jackie Robinson, the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I think whenever people ask the question, well, how come this story isn't as well known or even known among other people? I think it's because in some ways the narrative has been lost outside of perhaps Cleveland. So I wanted to sort of tell this narrative in a way that was really going to grab you and be like, this is just as entertaining, just as interesting, and just as meaningful. And you really need to sort of like convey that excitement.
Once you had all those disparate parts, though, the four men's biographies and all the facts, and I'm sure mountains of newspaper articles, the way that the book is constructed, I'm curious about that, because it really feels like four braids that kind of, that you take your time with each of them, and then they all come together finally. And I wonder about the construction of the book. Was that something you had to work with a lot? Did an editor help a lot with that?
Yes, absolutely. So it's interesting you would say that, because I hired an outside editor named Will Boggs, who was expert at weaving these things together. One of the big problems that I had as a writer here is that I did not, we talked about the four men that this book is about, and I did not want to just kind of have it be four different biographies told in separate chapters and then them kind of coming together in 1948. These men were sort of crossing, or at least kind of in the same vicinity, as early as the 1930s. And so I wanted to sort of like kind of really highlight whenever either they were in the same place as Bob Feller and Satchel Paige often were, or maybe doing similar things like Bob Feller and Larry Doby were doing in the Navy, things like this. And so I chose specific sort of moments like that would indicate just how closely they're interweaving. So I did not want this to be just sort of like rehashing of their biographies. Right. There's a lot in there, particularly about, say, Bob Feller in the 1930s and 40s, that I simply just had to leave out. I wrote, I think, 3 additional chapters on Bob Feller during the 1930s and 40s, and just like all the stuff that he was doing, all the sort of outings that he had. I wrote an entire chapter on the 1940 Indians who almost won the World Series. And I thought that would be an interesting chapter to include, because then it would show sort of Cleveland is just sort of almost there and never can get over the hump, including in 1940, whenever Feller almost does it. We had to cut all of that out. Yeah. We really just wanted it to be about the sort of like ways that these individuals were circling and dancing around each other until they came together.
And that's how it reads. And it's remarkable because there is all of this information that you present, but it's still a streamlined narrative. And that's a difficult thing to do. And you did a great job with it. The story just of the 1948 pennant race and World Series, but especially that pennant race, which was a nail biter, would have been a compelling book on its own. But the fact that you bring in these 4 biographies that, as you say, had been circling, some of them in some cases had been circling one another for a decade or more, is makes for a very compelling read, and I can't recommend it enough. But what are the elements that I want to sort of pick at, and one of the threads I want to pull at here is race. Our team, is a book about baseball. It's about the city of Cleveland. It's about the sort of the care and feeding of a Major League Baseball team. But it is inescapably a book about race, as you've indicated. Cleveland in 1947, of course, becomes just the second team and the first American League club to integrate, 11 weeks after Jackie Robinson debuts. And by 1948, they and the Dodgers each feature 2 black players.
Yeah.
Veeck, who signed both Doby and Paige, really did see things, I think, in pragmatic terms. He wanted the best team he could build, and so he went to the Negro Leagues to find talent. And he wanted to do this, in fact, even before he owned Cleveland, right? He was thinking about doing this had he bought the Phillies, for example.
Right.
But he also signed Lewis Jones as the team's assistant director of PR, who was the first black executive in the majors. And that is a remarkable achievement. Paige has got a long road coming from the Negro Leagues to the bigs. Doby, on the other hand, comes almost literally overnight after playing for F. Manley's Newark Eagles. He goes straight to Cleveland.
Yeah, literally overnight. Yeah.
Yeah. Feller spends years barnstorming, raising the profile of black baseball by playing a team of black stars.
Yeah.
But when he's given the opportunity to promote integration, he kind of demurs. And Doby, who is proud of his success and what it means for Black Americans as the first American League Black player, also speaks a lot in your book about the loneliness and the difficulty of being the first to integrate the American League. So I want to ask you what, first of all, made Cleveland the right place for Veeck to build the team that he did, and how race contributed to the circumstances that led to that 1948 World Series.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because Veeck himself, if you read his amazing autobiography, Veeck is in Wreck, which of course heavily
a great book, yeah.
my own telling of this story. He himself is kind of hesitant about whether or not Cleveland is the right setting for this. He sees Brooklyn as a multicultural sort of place that is ready for integration to happen because of the way that the borough is stitched together with different ethnicities and things like that. He doesn't believe the same is true of Cleveland, but in fact, Cleveland at that time had extremely, or I'm not going to say extremely, but it had sort of more progressive stands toward desegregation. There were, during the war, there were efforts to be made to try to address segregation throughout the city, try to address segregation throughout industries and things like this. And they were gaining sort of footholds through municipal councils and city boards and things like this. It was to an extent that Ebony magazine in 1950 said that Cleveland was the most progressive city in the country in terms of race relations. Mm-hmm. Cleveland itself has attracted a huge amount of immigrants to work in its factories. There was also a huge sort of in-country migration during the Great Migration from families from the South, particularly Alabama, that came up and into Cleveland. So it had a base that was ready for this sort of for this to happen. And you have to remember that the football team, the Cleveland Browns, integrated the year before the Indians did in 1946, and they won the championship and led the league in attendance. So it wasn't like integration was new by the time the Indians did it. It was primed for it. And Veeck himself, Veeck himself, he's a complicated guy. In one way, he was playing Moneyball by, as you said, sort of surveying the talent and where he could make the Indians sort of good right away. And he saw that in the Negro Leagues. He grew up in Chicago, which was, as I say in the book, kind of the nerve center of the Negro Leagues. It's where the East-West All-Star game for the Negro Leagues took place. Veeck attended many of these games as a kid. So he recognized the talent that was in there. There were sports writers who were amazed at Veeck's knowledge of the Negro Leagues. He could name not only players, but he could tell you what positions they played, what they did in certain years. He followed Negro League baseball and he recognized the talent that was there. So yeah, in terms of my own book, just kind of going off what you said there, the reason why I chose these four men in particular is because I think that they each represent a different facet of the integration experience. Mm-hmm. You've got two white individuals and two Black individuals. You've got in Veeck a more sort of progressive view of integration, sort of seeing the advantages of it. And of course, I think he's actually truly dedicated to it. He believes this in his progressive heart. You've got Feller, who is a little bit more of a traditionalist. As you say, he has no problem barnstorming with Satchel Paige and some of the best Black players in the Negro Leagues. He exposed himself to defeat numerous times. He got beat by Paige often on the barnstorming trail, and it wasn't something that he allowed it to happen. He took that as a competition. But then every time someone would ask him, well, do you think that these Black players could play in the major leagues? He is sort of continually hesitant about saying so. And the reason that I kind of give in the book is that he has this incredible narrative where he himself comes up as a prodigy. He makes it to the majors at age 17. He breaks all of these records right off the bat, and he attributes that through these sort of wholesome American values: hard work, rugged individualism, self-reliance, these things like this. And whenever he's talking about Black players and why they haven't had similar sort of breakthroughs, he's couching that as well in those terms. He's like, well, they haven't put in the work. Paige hasn't developed a curveball. He's not using his fastball enough. He's sort of couching it in these terms that not necessarily that there's a structural system that is against them, but that individually They
Right.
haven't sort of made it to that level yet. So he's an interesting sort of focus for the sort of the counterpoint of Veeck. Then you have Doby and Paige over here, and they themselves are pioneers, as we've talked about, but they are from very different generations, and they themselves kind of did not get along because of the ways that they sort of approached clubhouses, interacting with white players, interacting with the press, things like this. They had very different ideas of how to do this based on their own sort of formative experiences. So I thought that the sort of tension between those four individuals, in addition to the fact that they're circling each other and come together and win the World Series, but just what they each represent was fascinating. Sorry, that's a really long answer, Andrew.
No, that's good. That's a very good one. And with Feller, what you're talking about sounds like that sort of the white myth of the self-made man, right? Who doesn't recognize the advantages that he has from birth.
Absolutely. And I think I do use that in the book. I wanted to try to not to really sort of, put my own worldview on the thing, but he is in a sense the sort of quintessential white superstar of that era. And I think it resonated even more because Bob Feller makes his breakthrough in 1936 when he is 17. So America and the world is still sort of recovering from the Depression, where people started to question whether or not the so-called American dream is still alive. And you see Feller, who never goes to the minor leagues, is a junior in high school, jumps right into the majors, and his first ever start ties the American League record for strikeouts in a game. And people are couching this, or at least white sports writers are couching this thing, and look, the American dream is alive. This kid did it. And Feller sort of uses that in his interviews. I think he's very sort of self-aware, and he's sort of aware of the power of his narrative. And so he himself parrots this, pretty much his entire life. Like, I did this through hard work. I did my farm chores. My dad and I threw every day. I've improved. I relied on sort of the family. I didn't ask for any sort of special treatment. I did it myself. It's this very sort of like white ideal of achieving this American dream. And he applies that then to Black players, or at least it seems like he does whenever he's talking about them in interviews. And he's like, well, they're not here because they haven't put in the work. They haven't sort of done the things that you need to do individually to make it to this level. And throughout the rest of his life, he speaks in those similar terms and doesn't see the sort of structural boundaries that he as a white man did not have to encounter.
It's interesting, your book coming out, so shortly after Major League Baseball's announcement that they would recognize the Negro Leagues between 1920 and 1948 as major leagues, right? And part of the traditional resistance to that from people who, baseball people, was that, well, one of them was that the Negro Leagues played so few games, right? That the schedules tended to be so short. But of course, they needed to find time to fit in other games that were going to make them money, right? They had to be playing teams of white all-stars or traveling, so you had to be playing 2 or 3 games a day. And that's why the schedule was the way that it was, right? But our inability to recognize that sometimes as baseball people comes from our own, similar to Feller, right? We see it, well, why didn't they just play more games? Well, because there were things in their way, right? There were real barriers.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing, because I think that after that sort of first section where I talk about in 1941, Feller and Paige barnstorm against each other for the second time, and they do just a very quick 3-city tour. And this is the first time that I've really found where Feller kind of talks about, he says things like this, that someone asked him if Satchel Paige could be a major leaguer, and he's kind of like, I don't know, like his curveball's not so good, his fastball's not so good, that sort of thing. And it's interesting because like a month or two earlier, Paige kind of flips the script whenever somebody asks him about major leaguers, and he's like, shoot, those major leaguers don't work hard at all. He's like, we play all the time.
Yeah.
He says, oh, they think that like throwing twice in a week is hard. Like, I throw twice in a week would be a vacation for me. Yeah. He's like, we're throwing all the time, and these major leaguers, they're saying that we don't put in the hard work. He's looking at them and being like, we're doing way more hard work than they are. And it's this sort of inability for Feller to sort of see that.
I'm wondering if all these dynamics, these different characters and their personalities, which read almost like a Greek drama, the way that you've
Yeah.
kind of twisted them together and played them off one another. But these are based on the facts, right? But I'm wondering how much of that you were aware of before you began writing the book, or if that's something that came up during your research.
Oh, I was not aware of that. Obviously, I knew Veeck well, as I said, from having grown up around St. Louis, and I'd read Veeck as in Rec, and so, you know, I mean, his personality I thought was going to be the sort of driving force to it because he is so outsized. He's larger than life, even whenever he's a young man. And then, of course, you put in Paige, and I sort of knew the parameters of Paige, but I didn't realize the sort of depth of him. You know, I mean, the sort of, I mean, in addition to what he's just saying there, where he's throwing it back at people by saying like, well, they're the ones not working as hard. Like his intelligence just runs so deep.
Yeah.
I mean, intelligence in so many different ways. Like some of these things, whenever he's being interviewed, it's almost like he had scripted answers. He's just so quick on the draw.
Right.
Like he's fast and he's funny and he's smart. It's just like, it's amazing. And I knew nothing about Doby or Feller before I wrote this book. Larry Doby was a name that was a footnote to me before I started. I didn't know where he was from. I didn't know anything about his career. And it was one of those things where about midway through the sort of year of research that I did, I stopped myself and was just like, how is this real? Like everything about this is extraordinary. Like all of these people and their personalities, and like just the sheer coincidence of, for example, Bob Feller and Satchel Paige barnstorming against each other for a dozen years and then coming together on the same team.
And Feller shorting him, right? When they're in California together, Feller shorting Paige, and then somehow, you know, then they wind up as teammates in Cleveland. And
it's amazing. I mean, it's just the sort of, I really thought to myself that I don't think I can write another book because I'll never find a story as great as this one. This is such an incredible story. And I don't mean to say I told it great. I'm just saying that researching it, I was like, wow, everything that you could want for a compelling narrative is here. And you top it off with the World Series win. It was amazing.
It was something. And I have to tell you that the way that you've written it makes Paige's almost complete absence from that World Series heartbreaking. You know, it bears elements of a tragedy, right? That's as close as he gets. And he is on the team, you know, he shares in the victory, but he doesn't get to, despite all of the work that he did that season to get there in what was a very tight race.
I think that it got edited out, but I had a much longer sort of section about how like it mirrored his life, because he's so clearly, whenever he's in the Negro Leagues in the 30s, he's so clearly major league material. Everybody is saying so at the time. You can find numerous quotes from people saying he belongs. And it seems like his moment has passed by the time the Jackie Robinson integrates Major League Baseball in 1947. And it's only this sort of like last minute Bill Veeckian, you know, just inspiration that brings him into the league, where he gets this sort of long lost opportunity, and it's almost a little bit too late for him to show what he can really do. And the World Series is the same way. You've got these first 4 games that pass where the pitching is brilliant and nobody needs relief. And so Paige is sitting there in the bullpen being like, I'm not going to get in. This is impossible. I can't get in. And then in the 5th game, he requires Feller to fail in order for him to get into the World Series.
But even then, he's what? He's the 3rd guy out of the pen or something, right? He's not.
There's all these people that come in before him that he himself is like, oh, those guys can't make it. And I mean, the most interesting thing that you know, the thing that got me thinking about this, in addition to Paige himself kind of, you know, mentioning something similar in his autobiography, but if you read a lot of his interviews from the sort of later in his life, I'm thinking the 60s and 70s, he's pretty bitter about it. There's a great interview with him in the Cleveland Press in, I believe, 1971, where he is just like, he's enraged. He's like, why wasn't I starting? Why wasn't I in there? I was such a huge part of the team, and I only threw 2/3 of an inning. He's mad about it.
Does that do you think there's any sort of responsibility or guilt on Veeck's part about that? And like, you know, he brings them into St. Louis then after that. So, you know, Paige he's still a capable pitcher, but he's really, he's advanced in age at that point. But Veeck brings him into St. Louis. Is there some element of that? Does Veeck feel responsible for bringing Paige into that situation in Cleveland and then not allowing him to shine on the biggest stage?
I mean, I can't psychoanalyze Veeck to this extent, but people asked a similar sort of question about bringing Satchel Paige into Major League Baseball in 1948 with the Indians. Was this just a way for you to either get publicity or to do something that you've always wanted to do? And Bill Veeck sees Satchel Paige pitch at least as early as 1934 when he watches a game where Satchel Paige plays against Dizzy Dean in Los Angeles. It's a barnstorming game. And they each go the distance. Paige strikes out like 17 or something like that and wins 1-0. And so Veeck has this in his mind that, like, if I could put him onto the team, we would be set. And so there was this, people were accusing Veeck in 1948 of just putting Paige on the team for publicity purposes or to right an historic wrong. And Veeck was adamant. He's like, no, this guy, he can help us. He's going to help us win. And I would imagine that he would say the same thing about the Browns, because Satchel Paige's last year on the Browns, when he's 47, he makes the All-Star team. And Veeck claims that Paige was the best reliever in Major League Baseball at that time. And even though he has to give up ownership of the team after 1953, Veeck, I believe, says somewhere, I can't remember where, but he's kind of appalled that nobody else picks up Paige. He thought that Paige had a lot more left in the tank. So I think that Veeck was doing it simply because publicity certainly didn't hurt, but he really believed in Paige, and he was right.
It was, yeah, it's remarkable, and you write it that way. I will say that you do write it to clearly display that Veeck was just looking for anything that was going to help the team in during that when he brought.
Particularly because in 1948, Bob Feller has, up until that point, the worst season of his career. He has a losing record through the first half of the season, and the Indians are finally putting it together, and their ace pitcher is really kind of acting like an anchor around them. And so they desperately needed pitching. And so, it wasn't like Veeck was trying to find it wherever he could, and he found it in Satchel Paige.
And he got lucky too with a couple of guys that weren't names, right? Like Steve Gromek and
Gene Bearden.
Right. Who kind of come out of nowhere to help this team, which is remarkable. There's a photograph I want to ask you about that. It's the subject of one of the chapters toward the end of the book. The photos of Doby and of Steve Gromek embracing the clubhouse after winning Game 4 of the World Series against Boston. And Doby says about that picture, "It finally showed a moment of a man showing his feelings for me." I wonder, without giving too much away, because people need to buy the book and read it, but what you might say about the importance of that photograph.
Yeah, I mean, Doby, it's such a great thing for Doby to say, because Paige and Veeck and Feller are so good with the press in their own ways. They're so good about taking their narrative and sort of using it, manipulating it, sort of advancing it, things like that. Whereas Doby is so uncomfortable around the press. He's a introverted man. He is, as you said earlier, he's plagued by loneliness throughout his first year and a half with the team. And whenever you do see these interviews with him, they're almost heartbreaking, because he's so open about it. Like in spring training in 1948, reporter catches up to him in Oklahoma City, and he's just saying, "Oh, I'm so lonely. I expected to be, but I'm kind of by myself all the time, and I don't understand why people are doing this." And it's just, he's wearing it on his sleeve. And it just seems like he comes up in 1947 on the Indians without having played any time in minor league baseball. Nobody knows who he is. He wasn't like Jackie Robinson, who was a star in UCLA and sort of more nationally known. And he gets a rough reception on the team. And there are a lot of people on the team that sort of feel like he didn't earn his spot, that he didn't deserve to be there, regardless of the race angle. And then you put in the race angle, and it gets even worse. There were people that didn't want him there because of the race angle too. And so he's not expected to make the team in 1948. He struggles. And I think that it's just sort of a constant, it's a constant sort of, quest to sort of show that he belongs there, to be a part of the team, to all this sort of stuff. And it's like, whenever Gromek embraces him after Doby hits the home run in game 4, it's this spontaneous gesture that is happening. And you can see in their faces this sort of like this unadulterated, unfiltered joy that is coming from them. And it's sort of is like, finally, the defenses are dropped and I got sort of, I got sort of accepted. It really sort of feels like he didn't feel like maybe he was a full part of the team until that moment. And like I said with Doby, his interviews are so great because his emotions are raw and he lets you see them.
I think you hit it on the head there. He seemed like an unguarded individual, somebody who was not necessarily aware of how I don't want to say artificial, but how careful he needed to be when he was speaking to the press, right? He doesn't seem to have had much guile when it came to those things. And he always, unfortunately, reads like a footnote because of the timing of his debut, right? Quickly on the heels of Jackie, but you do a tremendous job of elevating his story. And I love that tidbit about how when he was attending Long Island U and playing with Newark, he had to play under an assumed name, and he chose the name Larry Walker, which of course turns out to be another Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned that Doby is the only one who didn't write his own autobiography. Was making more of his story one of your aims when writing the book?
Yeah, it certainly became that whenever when I started to do the research. I mean, there's two things that I was sort of trying to do here. The book starts with chapter 1 starts with Bob Feller's story, and I spent a bit of time sort of going through the thing that I had said. It's this miraculous origin story where his father, Bob Feller's father, he grows up on a farm in rural Iowa. His father sort of recognizes this extraordinary talent in his son, and he clears out a piece of his farmland and builds a baseball field on there. It's basically the Field of Dreams sort of story.
It's got elements of Superman and Field of Dreams sort of all together.
Yeah,
right?
Just all coming together. And Feller just has this ferocious fastball that is just like becomes so much that high schools are reluctant to play against him. Mm-hmm. And he gets signed by the Indians through various circumstances, goes directly to Cleveland at age 17, gets put onto the roster unexpectedly, and just immediately starts setting records. It's really an origin story that you can't conceive of today. I mean, it would be, I don't even know. I mean, his baseball card would be thousands of dollars if he did that. Yeah. But what I was kind of trying to do there at the end, though, was show that Larry Doby's story is equally as exciting, interesting, and improbable. Yeah. Like, I mean, he goes from sort of a great but to white baseball unknown player from the Newark Eagles, where he is playing on the Newark Eagles one day, hops a train, goes to Chicago where the Indians are playing, and is at bat for the Indians the next game. And it's just this amazing journey that he has to take. He completely falls on his face in 1947. He's so nervous when he's going to the plate that his teeth are chattering. Yeah. And then in 1948, the Indians do not expect him to make the team whatsoever. He's supposed to go down to the minors. And he has this miraculous turnaround that I think really is the spark that finally gets the Indians into the World Series. And it culminates then in Doby hitting this home run. So like, what is kind of at the beginning is sort of this quintessential white narrative of sort of achievement and accomplishment that Feller is allowed to do, ends with this new narrative that will take you into the second half of the 20th century that Larry Doby has carved out for himself. So I really wanted to sort of show how his story is, it's just equally as amazing and up there, but unfortunately it's been a little bit lost. Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to sort of recreate its excitement.
I like the fact that part of that team too was made up in a sense of sort of converted or spare parts, right? Because Doby was an infielder, right? And he out of necessity was put into center field. And Lemon, right? Bob Lemon was not a pitcher.
He came up as a third baseman. They switched him to the outfield. And I mean, again, another sort of incredible story.
Yeah.
He is drafted into the war and he plays baseball in Hawaii for some service teams. And they're playing often. And so they're sort of short on pitchers. And Lemon just kind of takes the mound. He's never pitched. He's not a pitcher, but he has a sort of natural spin on his ball that like major leaguers recognized. And so whenever he comes back from the war, he plays center field, but he can't hit above 200. So they're about to send him down whenever somebody, I think it was in the Yankees, somebody pulls aside the manager, Lou Boudreau, and says, hey, wait a minute, that guy over there was an awesome pitcher in the war. Why not try him? And they're like, sure, okay. It's just incredible. Yeah, you got Lemon, you got Gene Bearden, who was a guy who was severely injured in the war,
right?
To the point where he has to learn how to throw a knuckleball to sort of be viable. Comes out of nowhere and wins 20 games. And then, of course, you have Lou Boudreau, who we haven't talked about, but who I think was, you know, to a lot of Cleveland fans, was the most important guy on that team. He wins the MVP in 1948. He's the player manager. He becomes the sort of youngest full-time player manager at age 24 whenever he took over the team in 1940. And Veeck did not think he was the best tactician as a manager and tries the entire offseason before 1948 to unload him to the St. Louis Browns. And it's only basically through an uprising on the Cleveland streets that Veeck keeps him. And so Boudreau has a lot to prove, and he does. He wins the MVP. So
yeah,
there's a lot of people like that on that team.
Section where you're talking about Veeck, I mean, it almost reads like a montage in a film script where he's just kind of traipsing around Cleveland, taking the pulse of the average Clevelander, asking them what they think of Boudreau and should Boudreau stay. And they all 201 tell Veeck, don't get rid of him.
I mean, Veeck is so distinctive looking. He didn't wear a hat. He didn't wear a tie. He had this sort of open shirt. He has this curly hair. He is missing a leg, and so he was on crutches. And so he's just sort of walking around the more sort of like pedestrian areas of Cleveland, and everybody sees him and is like, there's Veeck. And so they're all going up to him and just be like, Veeck, don't trade Boudreau. Don't trade Boudreau. It's just this great, it's cinematic. Yeah.
There's a relationship too that, I think probably could be a book on its own too. And that's that the organization brings back sort of a ghost from the past. They bring Tris Speaker in to help Doby learn how to play the outfield. And on the face of it, Speaker is not an incredibly tolerant man. He's from Hubbard, Texas, and he's not known for his progressive views, but somehow it works. And he's able to, first of all, he gains respect for Doby, and he's able to impart some of his wisdom, right? As a center fielder patrolling the enormous grounds of Dunn Field way back in the day in Cleveland, he knew how to play center field, and he taught that to Doby.
Yeah, I didn't have as much time to go into it just because of, word count and restraints and stuff. There's a fantastic biography of Speaker by Timothy Gay that I really recommend. It's really, really fantastic. I will say that if you read the interviews that Tris Speaker does in 1948, 1949, when he talks about Doby, it's really just, I mean, you can just imagine him seeing Doby and just immediately recognizing the talent. He's just awed by the talent. I think at one point he tells an interviewer, if I only had somebody with his talent when I was coaching, he's like, that's who I was looking for. And so even though he did grow up in Texas, there were sort of rumors that he had joined the Ku Klux Klan at one point. And later in his life, he did like talking about the Civil War from a Southern perspective. Doby's talent to him was undeniable, and he had spent his whole life looking at talent. In Doby, he was just like, it's right there. Like, yeah. And so he really takes a shine to him.
This is a full circle moment because I did quite a bit of research into Speaker when I was writing my book, because Speaker played one sort of barnstorming exhibition game here in Peterborough, Ontario.
Oh, cool.
In the fall of 1923. He and Cobb came north. They played a game with some friends in Toronto, and then Cobb took off to go hunting and fishing. And Speaker and the rest of his team, including Roger Peckinpah, who was, I guess, with Washington at that time, stopped here, and the field is still there. So that's...
Oh, wow, that's awesome. I love that barnstorming.
Yeah, anything for a buck, right?
Yeah. Right.
I've only got one more question I wanted to ask you. Feel free to tell me anything else that I've yet to bring up, but I wanted to bounce back to 1946.
Yeah.
And of the return to baseball after the war years, you write, Tigers third baseman George Kell later told writer Danny Peary, "It was as if the entire country were saying, we've all been through this terrible war, and now here's baseball, one of the great constants in our lives." Do you see something similar happening this season as life gradually, hopefully, knock wood, returns to something approaching normal? Is baseball going to prove to be something around which we all gather together?
Well, I haven't thought about that, but that's an interesting question simply because the conditions are set. People are getting their vaccines, and baseball is an open air sport. So people might be more inclined to go to a stadium like that rather than sort of a closed stadium. So there could be a sort of resurgence of fans that you see here. I mean, one of the more sort of, I mean, everything was exciting as we talked about, but I mean, the sort of interesting thing that you see is that Bill Veeck comes to Cleveland in 1946, and he says in interviews at the time that you could sense it, that fans were needing something, that they were wanting something, and that he believed that baseball could provide it. It was sort of normalcy, a sort of way of getting back. And then they come out in numbers that they'd never come out before. It's just record setting across the board.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does seem like if Bill Veeck were around now and he were looking for a team, this would be a prime year for Vecchian antics to like light a fuse under a city. Yeah, boy, we need another Veeck. Yeah.
I try to imagine I can't imagine being anywhere with 80,000 people right now, but I try to imagine being at a baseball game with over 80,000 people, and it just blows my mind.
Yeah, and that they were doing that sort of regularly that season. It really was a frenzy.
Incredible. Well, Luke, I want to thank you for talking to me today. This was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I want to thank listeners for tuning in. Luke Epplin's book is Our Team, the epic story of four men in the World Series that changed baseball, published by Flatiron Books. Take care, everyone. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you again.